In the autumn of 1944, a German tank crew in eastern France looked up and saw something that should not have been dangerous. It was a Piper Cub, a tiny, slow, fabric-covered observation plane, the most harmless aircraft over any battlefield, the kind that puttered along overhead spotting targets and never carried a weapon. There was no reason on earth to be afraid of it, and then the little plane tipped over, dove straight at them, and fired a rocket into their tank. The aircraft was called Rosie the Rocketer, and the man flying it, diving an unarmed spotter plane directly into a column of German armor, was an American major who, in civilian life, taught high school history. His men called him the Mad Major. The Germans just learned to fear the little plane. His name was Charles Carpenter, and by that autumn he had turned the most defenseless airplane in the U.S. Army into a tank killer. Bolted to the wing struts of his little Piper were bazookas, the shoulder-fired anti-tank rockets that infantrymen used on the ground. 6 of them, wired so he could fire them from the cockpit. We are going to tell you what he did with them, and we are deliberately not going to tell you how the rig was built, because the how is not the point and never was. The point is the sheer nerve of the idea, that a man in a plane made of fabric and tubing, with no armor and no real speed, would fly down to 100 yards from a German tank into the range of every gun that tank's crew could bring to bear, and shoot it. It worked astonishingly well. Carpenter's tactic was as simple as it was terrifying to watch. Find the German armor, climb Tip Rosie into a dive, and come down on the tanks from above and behind, where their armor was thinnest and their guns could not easily point, firing his rockets at close range before hauling the little plane back up into the sky. A tank is a fortress on the ground, but its roof and its engine deck are vulnerable, and a rocket coming steeply down from above could find them. Carpenter flew the profile again and again, and German vehicles began to burn under the guns of an aircraft that, by every rule of war, should not have been able to hurt them at all. Over the fighting in Lorraine that autumn, Major Carpenter was credited with knocking out a German armored car and several tanks. The accounts most often say 4, including heavy Panther tanks, in the space of a single month. Think about what that means. A Panther was one of the best tanks in the world, crewed by veterans, and here they were being destroyed by a man in a $200 spotter plane with infantry rockets strapped to the wings. It made Carpenter something that almost should not exist. An aviator who was a tank ace. The newspapers back home, when they got hold of the story, could hardly believe it either. Neither, one imagines, could the Germans. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like and stay with us all the way to the end. The men who flew and served alongside Carpenter gave him his other nickname, the Mad Major, and they meant it with a mixture of admiration and genuine alarm. Because the thing about diving an unarmed fabric airplane onto German tanks is that the tanks, and everything around them, shoot back. Carpenter was flying, deliberately and repeatedly, into concentrated ground fire in an aircraft with no protection whatsoever, no armor plate, no self-sealing tanks, nothing between him and a bullet but doped canvas. A single well-aimed burst could have ended him at any moment on any of those dives. He knew it perfectly well. He kept doing it, with a cheerfulness that his fellow pilots found almost harder to understand than the danger itself. He came very close, often, and he wrote about it home with a kind of breezy understatement that tells you everything about the man. In a letter to his family in August 1944, Carpenter described his recent flying, almost as if reporting on a fishing trip. Lately, he wrote, "I have been taking quite a few chances, but my luck has been marvelous. Yesterday," he went on, "I got a bullet hole through the wing and hit a church steeple with one wheel." A bullet through the aircraft and a collision with a church mentioned in the same casual breath as his marvelous luck. This was a high school history teacher describing, to his wife and children, a day at the office that would have left most people shaking. He seemed genuinely to be enjoying himself. From the German side, Carpenter must have been maddening. Picture it from inside a Panzer. You are a veteran tank crew, and the threats you are trained to watch for are enemy tanks, anti-tank guns, artillery, and the fast fighter bombers that scream down at you. What you are not watching for, what nobody would think to watch for, is the little liaison plane loitering harmlessly overhead, because that plane is a spotter, not a shooter. And then the spotter kills you. His daughter would later put it perfectly, describing what her father did as a sparrow attacking an elephant. Except, she said, this sparrow had fangs. The Germans had no answer for the Sparrow, because the whole point of the Sparrow was that it wasn't supposed to have fangs. The stage for Carpenter's most famous work was a battle called Arracourt, fought in the Lorraine region of eastern France in September of 1944. As the American armies drove toward Germany, the Germans threw fresh Panzer brigades into a counterattack against General Patton's advancing forces, and for days tanks fought tanks across the misty, rolling French farmland. It was exactly the kind of target-rich, fast-moving armored battle in which a man in a spotter plane could see everything, and if he were mad enough, do something about it. Carpenter flew over Arracourt and did something about it. And by doing so, an unarmed observation pilot wrote himself into the record of one of the war's significant tank battles. The story was too good to stay quiet, and it didn't. War correspondents found Carpenter and his rocket-armed Cub, and Bazooka Charlie and Rosie the Rocketer turned up in military and civilian publications alike, including the famous armed forces newspaper Stars and Stripes. Here, in the middle of a grinding, brutal war, was a story that made people grin. The mild schoolteacher in the toy airplane who was blowing up Hitler's tanks with infantry rockets. The name he had painted on Rosie's nose was itself a small piece of Americana, Rosie the Rocketer, a nod to Rosie the Riveter, the women building aircraft in the factories back home. Carpenter had turned his improbable war into a piece of folklore even while he was still fighting it. Not everyone was charmed. An unarmed observation plane was an expensive, scarce, and important asset, and its actual job, finding targets and directing artillery, saved far more lives than any number of tanks Carpenter could personally shoot. There were officers who felt the Mad Major was risking a valuable aircraft and his own irreplaceable neck on stunts. But it is hard to argue with results, and Carpenter's results were real. German armor destroyed, and more importantly, American ground troops who did not have to face those particular tanks because a Sparrow with fangs had gotten to them first. Whatever the brass thought of his methods, Carpenter was, by the measure that mattered, saving American lives. And that was the question that hung over everything Carpenter did. How long can luck like that possibly last? He was flying a fabric plane into ground fire, over and over, in a war that killed careful men every day by the thousand. The odds do not favor a man who volunteers, again and again, to be the slowest, lowest, most exposed aircraft over a battlefield full of people trying to kill him. By the rules of probability, Bazooka Charlie should not have survived his own tactics. As it turned out, the thing that finally grounded him did not come from a German gun at all. It came from inside his own body, and it was already there, growing while he flew. Before we come to that, to the illness that took him out of the sky, and to what became of the Mad Major and his little plane afterward, it's worth stopping to understand just how unlikely this whole thing was in the first place. Because Charles Carpenter was not a warrior by nature or by training, he was about the least likely tank-killing ace the war produced, and the aircraft he did it in was designed, specifically and deliberately, never to fight at all. To see why Bazooka Charlie is such an astonishing story, you have to understand the gentle history teacher and the harmless little plane that the war turned into legends. Before we go back to the beginning, stay with the turn the story takes in 1945, because it's the part that makes Carpenter a man and not just a legend. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We make these to keep exactly these people from being forgotten. For all his tempting of fate over the tanks of Lorraine, the enemy never did bring Charles Carpenter down. What grounded him in 1945 was a diagnosis. Doctors found Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer, in his neck. The Mad Major, who had dived a fabric airplane into German armor and walked away every time, was taken out of the cockpit not by a shell but by his own cells, and put into a hospital bed with a grim prognosis. The prognosis was not good. The doctors gave him a limited time, the way doctors did in the 1940s with a cancer like that. Carpenter characteristically outlived it. But the war had taken its toll in ways that went beyond the disease. The biography written later, with the help of his own daughter and his wartime letters, does not pretend that Bazooka Charlie came home whole. He returned, like so many men, to a life and a marriage strained by the years and the distance and the things he had seen and done. A marriage that, by the time he got home, was near breaking. The cheerful daredevil of the letters was also a man carrying the ordinary, heavy costs that the war extracted from nearly everyone who fought it. What he did was go home and become, again, exactly what he had been before, a teacher. Charles Carpenter put away the Mad Major, salvaged his marriage, beat back the timeline his doctors had given him, and returned to the classroom to teach history to American teenagers, many of whom, one assumes, had no idea that the middle-aged man at the chalkboard had once been an ace who killed Panther tanks with a Piper Cub. He lived on for 2 decades after the war that should, by several different measures, have killed him. He died in 1966, and that, for a long time, was very nearly the end of the story. The Mad Major gone, and his impossible airplane vanished into the vast anonymous surplus of a finished war. What happened to Rosie is the best possible ending, and we will get to it. But to feel the full weight of it, to understand why grown aviation enthusiasts weep over a restored fabric airplane, you first have to understand what that plane was, and what Charles Carpenter was before either of them became famous. So let us finally go back to the beginning, to a history teacher from Illinois, to the gentle little aircraft the Army called the Grasshopper, and to the moment a mild-mannered man decided he was done watching the war from above and wanted, instead, to fight it. Before the war, Charles Carpenter was a high school history teacher and football coach from Moline, Illinois, intelligent, athletic, well-liked, and about as far from a hardened killer as a man can be. When the United States entered the war, he volunteered in 1942 at the age of 30, older than most of the men he would serve with. And he was funneled toward one of the least glamorous jobs in military aviation, the liaison pilot, the man who flew the small, slow, unarmed planes that were the eyes of the artillery. To even qualify, a liaison pilot had to be light. There was a weight limit around 170 pounds, because the aircraft were so small and underpowered. Carpenter made the weight and learned to fly the little planes and went to war in a Grasshopper. The Grasshopper was the military version of the Piper Cub, the L-4, a tiny 2-seat plane of steel tubing and fabric, with a small engine, no armor, and no guns. Armies used these little liaison aircraft and their cousins the Stinsons and Aeroncus to do the unglamorous, vital work of the battlefield, floating over the lines to spot enemy positions, direct artillery fire, carry messages and officers, and evacuate the wounded. They were, in every sense, non-combatant aircraft. A Grasshopper pilot's job was to see, not to shoot. He was supposed to stay high enough and far enough back to survive, precisely because his plane could not defend itself. Which is what makes what Carpenter did with his so completely against the entire idea of the aircraft. And here is where the history teacher's frustration became legend. Carpenter hated watching from his safe perch overhead as German armor moved and fought below him with nothing he could do about it. So, with the help of his ground crew, he did the thing no one was supposed to do. He acquired bazookas, the infantry's anti-tank rockets, and had them mounted on his plane. He started with a pair, found that it worked, and kept adding more until Rosie carried 6, which he could fire from the cockpit. We will say again, plainly, that we are not describing how this was done, and it does not matter to the story. What matters is the idea that a man looked at the most harmless airplane in the army and saw in it a way to kill tanks. It was against regulations, against doctrine, and against common sense. It also worked. So that is the full, unlikely picture. A 30-year-old history teacher who made the weight limit for the Army's least warlike airplane, and who then, out of sheer frustration and nerve, turned that airplane into a tank destroyer and himself into an ace. Knowing all of that, the classroom, the football field, the gentle little Grasshopper designed never to fight, does not make Carpenter's dives onto the Panzers less astonishing. It makes them more. The Mad Major was not a natural-born warrior doing what warriors do. He was an ordinary, decent man who looked at an impossible problem and answered it with an idea so audacious that the enemy never saw it coming. And, remarkably, the airplane he did it in survived to tell the tale. For decades after the war, Rosie the Rocketer was just gone, one more war-surplus Piper Cub among thousands, its wartime identity forgotten, passed from owner to owner, its incredible history lost. And then, in recent years, in one of those small miracles that reward the patient, the actual airplane was found, the very L-4 that Charles Carpenter had flown into the Panzers at Arracourt, identified and traced across the decades to a museum in Europe. Aviation enthusiasts and historians realized what they were looking at. Not a replica, not a similar model, but Rosie herself, the Sparrow with fangs, improbably still in existence. They brought her back to life. The Collings Foundation, a group dedicated to preserving historic aircraft, acquired Rosie and had her painstakingly restored, and today Charles Carpenter's little tank killer flies again, an airworthy, honest-to-goodness survivor of the fighting over Lorraine, appearing at air shows where people can stand next to the actual fabric and tubing airplane that a history teacher once dove onto German tanks. When Carpenter's own daughter, who had written about her father, was finally shown the restored plane and helped into its tiny cockpit, she wept, realizing, sitting in that fragile little space, for the first time truly how exposed and vulnerable her father had been every single time he flew it. Major Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter of Moline, Illinois, history teacher, football coach, husband, father, and the most unlikely tank ace of the Second World War, survived his own reckless courage and the cancer that grounded him, went home, taught school for another 20 years, and died in 1966. He knocked out an armored car and several German tanks from the cockpit of an unarmed plane made of fabric, and did it with a grin and a letter home about his marvelous luck. And Rosie the Rocketer, the two-seat Piper Cub that had no business fighting anyone, survived the war, survived the decades, and flies still, a small, stubborn, airworthy monument to the idea that the right person with the right amount of nerve can turn even a Sparrow into something an army learns to fear. The German tank crews of Lorraine were watching the sky for fighters and bombers. What killed their tanks was a fabric Piper Cub flown by a schoolteacher who was simply too stubborn to watch the war from a safe altitude. Bazooka Charlie proved that the deadliest gun or the fastest plane, the dumbest the biggest gin or the fastest plane, but a man with an idea nobody else would dare to try, and the nerve to fly it straight down into the guns. People still argue about Bazooka Charlie, whether he was a genius or a lunatic, whether risking a scare-spotter plane on tank-hunting stunts was brilliance or recklessness, and how much of the legend the records fully bear out. Maybe you have a view. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family flew liaison planes, served in the artillery they spotted for, fought at Arracourt, or anywhere in Patton's advance across France, in any branch or any role, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them, one thing they did or said, or one thing you remember. The people who fought this war deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.